It often is. In the capital city of Nuuk in Greenland, Lucas Tomlinson has spent the week there.
Russia didn't laugh when Greenland came back into the conversation.
NATO cannot negotiate the sovereignty of Greenland.
That alone should tell you something. While headlines treated it like political noise, Russian planners treated it as a warning that arrived without an announcement. Because Greenland isn't a symbol, it's a constraint, and constraints don't argue, they just close options. What changed wasn't rhetoric or deployments. It was preparation, quiet, technical, and already underway. And once you understand what's being prepared around Greenland, you understand why Russia's room to maneuver in the Arctic is shrinking even without a single shot fired. Here's the mistake Russia keeps making and keeps paying for. It watches American politics instead of American positioning. From Moscow's perspective, the United States often appears distracted. Elections swing, presidents reverse tone, allies argue openly. Trust inside NATO looks noisy, fragile, contested. On the surface, that feels like opportunity. But militaries don't operate on vibes. They operate on geometry. And Greenland exposes a reality Russia would rather not confront. US military power doesn't rely on momentum or consensus. It relies on placement. Greenland isn't dangerous because American troops might stand there tomorrow. It's dangerous because the United States already built the architecture that makes standing there optional. Long before anyone joked about buying Greenland, the US military was already there. Thule Air Base, now known as Patuxent Space Base, has quietly anchored America's early warning and space surveillance network for decades. Missile detection, space tracking, Arctic domain awareness. None of it flashy, all of it permanent. From Russia's perspective, that base functions like a silent countdown clock, because any ballistic missile trajectory from Russia toward North America passes through the Arctic. There is no workaround, no alternate route, no clever detour. Greenland isn't a forward base, it's an interception lens, and this is where European deployments change the equation. The underlying cause is structural. Arctic routes are becoming usable, navigable, and militarily relevant. The effect is strategic tightening as surveillance, logistics, and rapid response capabilities move north alongside them. The consequence for Russia is existential pressure, because Arctic freedom isn't a luxury for Moscow, it's a requirement. Russia's nuclear deterrent relies heavily on submarines operating from the Kola Peninsula into the Arctic Ocean. Those submarines need depth, ambiguity, and space. Greenland collapses ambiguity. Not through confrontation, but through observation. And observation is the one thing Russia cannot intimidate away. That's why Russia doesn't respond aggressively to Greenland coverage. Any escalation there only highlights the vulnerability. Instead, Moscow shifts narrative focus elsewhere, toward Ukraine fatigue, European politics, US elections, anything that reframes the conversation away from geography, because geography doesn't argue back. And this is where Greenland ties directly into Russia's deeper problem with the US military. Russia's real problem isn't American size. Everyone knows the US military is big. The problem is that it doesn't need to move dramatically to change outcomes. It places assets early. It integrates allies quietly. It turns space, sea, and air into overlapping denial zones. Greenland is the cleanest expression of that philosophy. No invasion, no escalation, no red lines crossed. Just fewer options for Russia year after year. What changed recently isn't rhetoric, it's preparation. Publicly, nothing dramatic happened. No new base announcements, no troop surges, no confrontational language. But behind the scenes, the United States has been doing something far more consequential: mapping. Not cartography, targeting logic. US intelligence collection efforts tied to Greenland have expanded beyond observation and into systems-level understanding. Airfields, infrastructure, access routes, logistical choke points, the kinds of details you don't gather to monitor stability. You gather them to remove uncertainty. From Moscow's perspective, that distinction matters more than any public deployment ever could, because intelligence collection isn't about escalation. It's about option building. Once that information exists, it doesn't disappear when headlines fade. It sits inside planning models, inside contingency frameworks, inside simulations that never get announced. Russia understands this instinctively. You don't map critical infrastructure unless you expect to need decisions made faster than diplomacy allows. And when those maps exist, the margin for surprise shrinks permanently. This is why Greenland stopped being abstract for Moscow. Not because someone talked about it, but because someone started preparing around it quietly. And that leads directly into Russia's deeper miscalculation. From Moscow's point of view, this should have been working. The United States argues with Europe more openly than it used to. Trade disputes flare up. Defense spending complaints resurface. Political leaders publicly question reliability, commitment, even loyalty. On paper, that looks like fracture. Russia has built entire strategies around exploiting moments exactly like this. Moments where trust appears thin enough to pry apart. But here's the disconnect. Political trust and military trust are no longer the same thing. European leaders can criticize Washington on camera in the morning and still plug seamlessly into US-led command structures that afternoon. Air defense networks stay linked. Intelligence feeds keep flowing. Joint exercises continue on schedule. That contradiction confuses Moscow because Russia's historical playbook assumes something simple. If allies argue publicly, coordination must be weakening behind the scenes. That assumption is now wrong. What's actually happening is more dangerous for Russia. European militaries are becoming less emotionally dependent on Washington, while becoming more structurally integrated with it. They don't need reassurance, they need compatibility. And compatibility is harder to break than trust. The cause is fatigue. Europe no longer wants its survival tied to American politics. The effect is institutional alignment, systems designed to function with US assets regardless of who's in the White House. The consequence for Russia is brutal. Even when Washington looks divided, the machine keeps running. This is why Russia's messaging increasingly targets voters instead of generals. Generals already know the integration is real. Across Europe, what's expanding isn't sentiment, it's structure. Air defense systems link together. Logistics chains interlock. Planning synchronizes across regions that used to operate separately. None of this requires warm feelings. It requires predictability. And the US military provides that predictability in a way no European power can replicate alone. Russia doesn't fear European armies individually. It fears what happens when they stop acting individually. The US military remains Russia's biggest problem because it acts as the synchronizing force, the clock everyone else sets themselves by. Russia expected distrust to slow coordination. Instead, distrust accelerated standardization. Europe asked a dangerous question from Moscow's perspective. How do we function even if Washington is unpredictable? The answer wasn't separation, it was deeper military wiring. And that wiring still runs through the US military. This is where Russia's reading of Europe becomes dangerously outdated. Moscow still thinks in terms of loyalty and betrayal, alignment and defection, West versus not West. But Europe has moved somewhere more uncomfortable. Recent discussions about European security formats that function even without direct US leadership aren't about separation. They're about resilience. From Russia's point of view, that's worse. A Europe dependent on Washington can be pressured by targeting Washington's politics. A Europe wired to function regardless of Washington's mood can't. This isn't about replacing the United States. It's about removing single points of failure. European planners aren't asking, what if the US leaves? They're asking, how do we make sure the system keeps working even if it hesitates? That thinking doesn't weaken American power. It locks it in. Because once European forces are structured to operate autonomously and interoperably, the US military becomes an amplifier instead of a linchpin. Russia doesn't fear that emotionally, it fears it structurally. A fragmented alliance can be pressured. A modular alliance keeps functioning even when politics wobble. And that's the environment Greenland now sits inside. Not as an American outpost, not as a European symbol, but as a node in a system that no longer needs reassurance to stay aligned. This is the structural problem Moscow can't escape. Russia is a regional military power forced to behave like a global one. The United States is a global military power that can choose when to behave regionally. That asymmetry is everything. When Russia escalates in Ukraine, it doesn't just activate one front. Attention spreads outward, toward the Arctic, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the North Atlantic. Every movement triggers reactions across multiple domains. Now compare that to the US response. Washington doesn't surge everything to one place. It redistributes pressure. A carrier group rotates through the Mediterranean. Bomber task forces shift across the Atlantic. Submarines quietly reposition in the Arctic. Pre-positioned equipment moves inside Europe without headlines. Nothing dramatic, nothing panicked. And that's the point. Russia has to commit. The US only has to signal. Geography forces Russia to concentrate forces near flashpoints. Once units move, they're exposed, committed, and politically visible. That rigidity produces strategic exhaustion. Russia keeps preparing for worst-case scenarios everywhere. The US decides where to apply effort and where to wait. This is why Greenland matters more than it looks. Not because it's about invasion fantasies or territorial grabs, but because it sits at the hinge between theaters. Control of the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap doesn't win wars. It decides who gets freedom of movement. The US military understands this instinctively. Russia understands it painfully. Every Arctic reinforcement, every NATO deployment tied to Greenland, every quiet expansion of airfields and sensors forces Moscow to spread thinner, not thicker. Russia believes pressure works best when it's concentrated. The US military has learned pressure works best when it's distributed. So every reinforcement weakens another axis. Ukraine pulls resources from the Arctic. Arctic deployment strain the Baltic. Baltic readiness tightens the Black Sea. The US doesn't mirror this behavior. It rotates, it offsets, it shifts posture without locking itself in. That keeps options open, and Russia guessing. Wars aren't lost when you lose battles. They're lost when you lose choice. Here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. The US military isn't Russia's biggest problem because it has more weapons. It isn't because it has more bases, and it isn't even because it has more allies. It's because the US military is built for time and Russia isn't. Russia plans in windows, short campaigns, rapid escalation, decisive pressure before costs compound. That approach worked when wars could be localized, fast, and politically contained. The US military is built for something else entirely. Duration, not just fighting, sustaining, not just deploying, rotating, not just winning, continuing without breaking. That difference defines every strategic calculation Moscow makes today. Ukraine didn't defeat Russia by overpowering it. It forced Russia into a long war. A war where logistics mattered more than shock, where replacement cycles mattered more than initial strength, where coordination mattered more than bravado. And once that happened, the comparison with the US military became unavoidable. Because the US doesn't treat long wars as emergencies. It treats them as operating conditions. The US military was built during the Cold War to survive years of global tension without collapsing its economy, alliance network, or command structure. That design produces resilience. Units rotate instead of burning out. Command systems layer instead of centralizing. Allies absorb pressure instead of fragmenting. The result is strategic patience. The US can afford to wait for mistakes. Russia can't. Yes, the US has global bases. Yes, it has unmatched nuclear forces. Yes, it can project power anywhere on Earth. Everyone knows that. What matters is what those things enable. They allow the US to delay decisions instead of rushing them, respond asymmetrically instead of directly, and escalate selectively instead of reflexively. Russia doesn't get those choices. Every move Moscow makes feels urgent. Every deployment carries political risk. Every delay looks like weakness. That pressure compounds. Russian planners don't just face an enemy with more resources. They face an enemy that can afford to be calm. Calm is deadly, because calm means pressure builds naturally, without panic deployments, rushed offensives, or forced escalations. The US military doesn't need to threaten Russia constantly. It just needs to exist. Organized, patient, globally positioned, and Russia reacts to that existence every single day. That's why Greenland matters. That's why Arctic deployments matter. That's why Europe's trust wobbling but not collapsing still matters. Even when politics get messy, the military layer stays intact. Rotations continue. Exercises happen. Sensors stay online. Logistics routes remain open. Russia watches all of it and understands something deeply uncomfortable. The US military doesn't need a crisis to operate. Russia does. Russia can modernize weapons. It can build new missiles. It can adapt tactics. What it can't do quickly is rebuild a military culture designed for endurance, alliances, and global maneuver without urgency. That takes decades. The US already has it. That's why, even with distractions, even with political noise, even with shifting priorities, the US military remains Russia's biggest problem, not because it's loud, not because it's threatening, but because it's still there, still structured, still patient. And in modern warfare, patience backed by power is the most dangerous combination of all.